Welcome back to Farmer's Lore. May your day be steady, honest, and filled with Christ's strength. And now, let's turn to the page to today's story from the fields.
The dealer's name was Rick Patterson, and he said it with a smile, but there was an edge underneath. "Frank, that Farmall is going to kill you one of these days. You need to trade up before it's too late." It was March of 1983, a cold, grey Tuesday afternoon, and Frank Weber was standing in the showroom of Patterson's John Deere dealership in Waverly, Iowa. He'd driven 20 miles in his '76 Ford F-150 to buy parts for his 1954 Farmall Super M. The parts were simple: a water pump gasket, 3 spark plugs, and a fuel filter. Total cost, $23.50. He paid cash. Frank was 57 years old, had been farming the same 480 acres in Bremer County since 1963. The land had belonged to his father, who'd bought it in 1938 for $35 an acre during the Depression. His father had paid cash, saved for 8 years working as a mechanic to scrape together the money. The farm had never had a mortgage, not once in 45 years. The Farmall Super M sitting in Frank's machine shed was the same tractor his father had bought in April of 1954 for $2,400. His father had driven to this same dealership, then an International Harvester dealer, and counted out $2,400 bills on the counter. The salesman had been so shocked he'd called the owner to witness it. That was 29 years ago. The Farmall was old now, faded red paint, surface rust on the hood, the seat patched with duct tape. But it ran. Every spring, Frank rebuilt the carburetor, changed the oil, greased every fitting, adjusted the valves. The tractor started on the first pull and ran all season. Rick Patterson was leaning against a brand-new John Deere 4450 in the showroom, his arms crossed, his expression friendly but calculating. Rick was 43, had been selling tractors since 1968, and was good at his job. Very good. He could read farmers, knew when they were vulnerable, knew how to plant seeds of doubt about their old equipment. "I'm serious, Frank. That tractor is almost 30 years old. The parts are getting harder to find every year. The technology is obsolete. You're competing against guys with modern equipment. But more importantly, it's dangerous. No rollover protection, no cab, no safety features whatsoever. You're one accident away from leaving Carol a widow and your kids without a father." Rick let that sink in. The funeral angle usually worked. Make them imagine their wife crying, their kids growing up without them, then offer the solution sitting right there in the showroom. Frank looked at the 4450. It was beautiful, he had to admit. Enclosed cab with air conditioning and heat, power steering, modern hydraulics, 120 horsepower, twice what his Farmall had. And safe, with a rollover protection structure, seat belts, modern braking. The kind of machine a serious farmer should have in 1983. The price tag read $42,000. "Can't afford it, Rick," Frank said quietly. His voice was level, matter-of-fact. "Not even close." "That's what financing is for," Rick said smoothly. He'd shifted into his closing pitch now, the one he'd perfected over 15 years. John Deere credit can get you approved in 48 hours, 7% interest over 5 years. Your payment would be about $830 a month. That's totally manageable for a farmer with 480 acres like you've got. You're probably grossing what, $150,000 a year? $800 a month is nothing. Frank shook his head. "That's $10,000 a year just in payments, Rick. For 5 years, $50,000 total for a $42,000 tractor. I can't do it." "Frank, you can't afford not to do it," Rick said, his voice getting more serious now. This was the part where he got real, where he dropped the salesman persona and spoke man to man. "I've been selling tractors for 15 years. I've seen farmers get hurt on old equipment. Hell, I've been to their funerals. You remember Ed Morrison? Died 3 years ago when his old Alice rolled on him, left behind a wife and 4 kids. That tractor was from 1958, no rollover bar, just like yours." He paused for effect. Your Farmall doesn't have rollover protection. It doesn't have modern brakes. The steering is worn out. I can tell by how you're always fighting it. One mistake, one moment of bad luck, and you're crushed under 2 tons of metal. Is your life worth $830 a month? Is Carol's future worth it? Your kids? It was a good sales pitch. Rick had used variations of it hundreds of times over the years, appealed to safety, to family, to responsibility. Make them imagine their own funeral, their wife crying at the graveside, their kids growing up fatherless. Make them feel like buying new equipment wasn't just smart, it was morally required. Then offer the solution, the financing that made it all possible. But Frank Weber just picked up his paper bag of parts, paid his $23.50 in cash, and turned to leave. The Farmall's been good to my family for 30 years, Rick. My dad farmed with it for 17 years before he passed, and I've farmed with it for 12 years since. I expect it'll be good for another 30 if I take care of it. Frank, you're making a mistake, Rick called after him. That thing is a death trap. Sooner or later we all die, Rick, Frank said, pausing at the door. But I'd rather die farming than die in debt. He walked out. Rick watched through the showroom window as Frank climbed into his old F-150 and drove away. Rick shook his head slowly. Some farmers couldn't be helped. They were stuck in the past, too stubborn to see that the world had changed, that modern farming required modern equipment. Frank Weber would probably end up dead under that old Farmall within 5 years, and Rick would read about it in the Waverley newspaper and think, I tried to warn him. What Rick Patterson didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that he'd just witnessed something rare in 1983, a farmer who understood the difference between risk and danger, between being careful and being in debt, between having the best equipment and having paid for equipment. Frank drove home, the parts rattling in the truck bed. The 20-mile drive from Waverley back to his farm gave him time to think about Rick's pitch. Was he being foolish? Was the old Farmall really dangerous? His wife Carol was in the kitchen when he got home, making lunch for their 2 kids. Sarah was 8, Michael was 6. Both of them were at the kitchen table doing homework. The farmhouse was old, built in 1940, but solid. No mortgage, paid for. Get what you needed? Carol asked, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. Yeah, and got the usual sales pitch from Rick Patterson about buying a new tractor. Carol smiled. She knew Rick Patterson. Everyone in Bremer County knew Rick. He'd sold tractors to half the farmers in the area. Persistent guy, good at his job. Let me guess. He told you the Farmall was going to kill you. Pretty much. Said I need to trade up before I end up dead under it. What'd you tell him? That we can't afford it. Told him the same thing I told him last year and the year before that. Carol dried her hands on a dish towel and looked at her husband seriously. They'd been married 12 years, had farmed together through good years and bad. She trusted Frank's judgment, but she also worried. Farming was dangerous. Every farm wife knew that. Every year you heard about someone who got hurt or killed. Do you think it's dangerous? She asked quietly, glancing at the kids to make sure they weren't listening. Be honest with me, Frank. Is that tractor going to get you killed? Frank thought about it carefully before answering. This wasn't a question to brush off. Everything in farming is dangerous, Carol. New tractor, old tractor, doesn't matter. I've seen guys get hurt on brand new John Deeres because they got careless, thought the safety features would protect them, got overconfident. The Farmall is old, yeah, it doesn't have a cab or a rollover bar, but I know every inch of that machine. I know what sounds wrong, what feels wrong, what vibrations mean something's loose or worn. I'm more careful on it than I'd be on something new where I might get comfortable and stop paying attention. He paused, choosing his words. And Carol, we don't have debt, not a penny, not on land, not on equipment, not on anything except monthly bills. That Farmall is paid for, has been since 1954 when Dad bought it. Every repair I do on it I pay cash for the parts, maybe $200-300 a year. The dealer wants me to take on a $830 monthly payment. That's almost $10,000 a year for 5 years. That's $50,000 I'd pay out for a $42,000 tractor. Carol was quiet, listening. If I take on that debt, Frank continued, and we have one bad year, just 1 year where the corn doesn't yield or the prices tank, we're in trouble. We could lose everything trying to make payments. But with the Farmall, the only person I owe is myself. If I have a bad year, I tighten my belt, make do, and try again next year. The bank can't foreclose on equipment that's already paid for. He looked at his wife. I promise you I'll be careful. I'll maintain that tractor like my life depends on it, because maybe it does. But I'd rather risk working on old equipment I can afford than risk our family's future on debt I can't control. Carol nodded slowly. She understood. Her own father had lost his farm in 1952, buried in debt from equipment loans and land payments. She'd watched her mother cry as strangers auctioned off everything they owned. She'd sworn she'd never let that happen to her family. Just promise me you'll be careful, she said. Always am. Over the next 15 years, from 1983 to 1998, Frank kept farming with his old Farmall Super M. It became almost a point of pride, though Frank would never admit it. Every spring, like clockwork, he'd tear down the tractor, rebuild what needed rebuilding, replace what needed replacing. The engine got rebuilt in 1985 after 31 years, cost him $847 in parts and 3 weekends of work. A new engine from the dealer would have been $3,200 plus installation. The clutch needed replacing in 1987. Frank did it himself, ordered the parts from an aftermarket supplier for $220. Dealer wanted $890 for the same job. The hydraulics went out in 1989. Frank rebuilt the whole system. New pump, new lines, new cylinders. Parts cost him $435. Took him 2 weeks working evenings after fieldwork. The dealer would have charged $1,800. Every repair, Frank paid cash. Every part he bought from whoever had the best price. He kept meticulous records in a ledger, just like his father had taught him. In 15 years, from 1983 to 1998, Frank spent $4,287 on parts and maintenance for the Farmall. That averaged out to $285 per year. Meanwhile, if he'd bought that John Deere 4450 in 1983 at $830 per month, he would have paid $49,800 over 5 years. Then the tractor would have been paid off, but rapidly depreciating. By 1998, a 15-year-old 4450 would be worth maybe $18,000 if he was lucky. So he would have paid $49,800 and had an asset worth $18,000. Net cost, $31,800. Frank's way? Spent $4,287 over the same 15 years. The Farmall was worth nothing at the end, true, but he'd saved $27,513, and that's not even counting the interest he earned on the money he didn't spend, or the peace of mind from having no debt. Every time Frank went to Patterson's dealership for parts over those 15 years, Rick would make another pitch. The tractors got newer, fancier, more expensive. The Farmall got older, more worn, more obsolete by modern standards. Frank, that thing is a death trap, Rick said in 1990 when Frank came in for spark plugs. It's 36 years old. Come on, be reasonable. We've got a nice used 4430 on the lot. Only 8 years old. Perfect for your operation. $28,000, and I can get you financed easy. Can't afford it, Rick. Frank, you're being stubborn to the point of stupidity. Maybe, but I'm being stubborn without any monthly payments. Rick tried again in 1993. Frank, seriously, that Farmall is 40 years old. 40 years. That's older than most of my salesmen. We've got 0.9% financing on new equipment right now. You could get into a brand new 7600 for under $600 a month. Air-conditioned cab, GPS guidance, the works. Not interested. Why? Give me one good reason why. Frank looked at him. Because I sleep at night, Rick. Can you say the same? Rick finally gave up trying after that. Frank Weber was a lost cause, too stubborn to help himself. There were plenty of other farmers who would listen, who would trade up, who would finance. Rick made a good living off those farmers. He didn't need Frank Weber, but over the years, Rick noticed something he didn't want to think about too hard. The farmers who'd bought new tractors from him in the early 1980s, the ones who'd financed heavily right before the farm crisis really hit hard in 84 and 85, a lot of them lost their farms. Good farmers, smart men, hard workers. They just couldn't make the payments when grain prices collapsed and land values tanked. Frank Weber kept farming, with his old Farmall that everyone said would kill him. In 1994, one of Frank's neighbors, a man named Bob Henderson, stopped by the Weber farm one evening. Bob farmed 800 acres, had modern equipment, everything new within the last 5 years. But Bob looked stressed, worn out. "Frank, can I ask you something?" Bob said. They were standing in Frank's machine shed, where the old Farmall sat, as it always did, waiting for the next day's work. "Sure, Bob." "How do you do it? How do you keep going with that old equipment while the rest of us are killing ourselves trying to stay current?" Frank was surprised by the question. "I just fix things when they break. Work on it myself. Keep it running." "That's not what I mean," Bob said. "I mean, how do you handle the pressure? Everyone looking at you like you're backwards. The dealers telling you you're going to die. Your kids probably asking why you won't buy something nice. How do you just not care what people think?" Frank thought about that. "I do care what people think, Bob, but I care more about keeping my farm. Every farmer I know who lost their place in the 80s, they had newer equipment than me. They were trying to keep up, trying to look successful, trying to farm like the magazine said they should, and they lost everything." He patted the Farmall's fender. "This old girl doesn't look like much, doesn't impress anybody, but she's mine, paid for. Can't repossess what you own free and clear. That's worth more to me than having the fanciest tractor in the county." Bob nodded slowly. "I'm drowning, Frank. Got payments on 2 tractors, a combine, and a planter. Almost $5,000 a month total. Every month I wake up wondering if this is the month I can't make it." "Why'd you buy all that?" "Everyone said I had to. Said you can't compete with old equipment. Said the banks look at you better if you've got modern gear. Said—" Bob trailed off. "Hell, I don't know. Seemed like the right thing at the time." Frank didn't say anything. What was there to say? Bob had made his choices. "You were right," Bob said quietly. "Everyone thought you were the fool. Turns out we were." Bob Henderson lost his farm in 1996. Bank foreclosed. Bob moved to Waterloo, got a job at John Deere, ironically enough. Built the tractors he couldn't afford to buy. Last Frank heard, Bob was still there, still making payments on his house, still working. Frank kept farming. In 1998, 15 years after that conversation in the dealership, Rick Patterson's John Deere operation went through a rough patch. The farm economy was soft, grain prices were down, and farmers weren't buying. Corn was at $2.20 a bushel, soybeans at $5. Those were prices that didn't cover costs for most operations. Sales were down 40% from the previous year. Rick had to lay off 2 mechanics in August. Good men, guys who'd worked for him for 10 years, but he couldn't afford to keep them. The manufacturer was pushing him to hit sales quotas he couldn't possibly meet. Every month, corporate sent increasingly aggressive emails about his numbers. The pressure was intense, eating at him, affecting his sleep. One cold afternoon in October, a farmer came into the dealership looking at used tractors on the lot. Rick was in his office doing paperwork, trying to figure out how to make payroll, when his sales manager knocked on the door. "Rick, guy outside wants to look at the 824430. Says he might buy today if the price is right." Rick looked up. Cash sale. Exactly what he needed. He walked out to the lot and saw the farmer examining the tractor. Rick recognized him immediately. It was Frank Weber, still farming, still around after all these years. The man had to be 72 now. "Frank Weber," Rick said, walking over with his hand extended. "Haven't seen you in a while." Frank shook his hand. "Been busy farming. Don't get to town much unless I need to." "What brings you in today? Parts?" "No," Frank said, looking at the 4430. Finally time to buy a different tractor. My old Farmall gave out last month. Transmission died. Would cost more to rebuild than the machine is worth at this point. Rick felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with vindication. Finally. After 15 years of warnings, Frank Weber's old Farmall had finally failed him. The tractor hadn't killed him, but it had died, which meant Frank needed to buy. "Well, I'm glad you came to see us. Let's get you set up properly this time. We've got some fantastic new—" "I'm looking at this 824430, Frank interrupted, patting the tractor's hood. 16 years old, about 4,000 hours from what I can see on the meter. Looks well maintained. What are you asking?" Rick looked at the price sticker. It was an older used unit they'd taken in on trade 3 months ago. Nice tractor, but nothing special. They had it priced at $14,500, which was fair market. $14,500, Rick said. "But Frank, for just a little bit more, we could get you into something much newer. We've got a 94 model with only 1,200 hours, enclosed cab, air conditioning." "How much for cash?" Frank interrupted again. Rick stopped mid-pitch. "Cash? You mean cash? Not financed?" "Yeah. If I write you a check today, right now, what's your rock-bottom price on this 4430? Rick's mind raced. The dealership desperately needed the sale. They'd had the 4430 on the lot for 3 months with no serious interest. He'd paid $9,000 for it on trade-in. At $14,500, he'd make $5,500 profit. But a cash sale today, guaranteed money, no paperwork, no waiting for financing approval. 12,000 cash, Rick heard himself say. "But that's cutting it real thin for us." Frank pulled out his checkbook from his jacket pocket. "I'll take it at 12. Let's do the paperwork." 20 minutes later, Rick was sitting at his desk, processing the sale in a daze. Frank Weber had just written a check for $12,000 without blinking, without negotiating further, without asking about financing terms or trade-in value. Just pulled out his checkbook and wrote the check like he was buying groceries. "Frank," Rick said as he was finishing up the title transfer, "can I ask you something? How do you just have $12,000 sitting in your checking account? Most farmers I know are leveraged to the hilt." Frank looked at him across the desk. The old farmer's eyes were clear, sharp, intelligent. "Rick, I've been farming for 51 years now, since I was 21. Took over from my dad when he passed in 63. Every single year that I didn't have a tractor payment, that was money I kept. Call it $8,000–10,000 a year I didn't pay to a dealer or John Deere credit or a bank." He paused, doing mental math. 51 years of farming. About 40 of those years with no equipment payments because I kept fixing that old Farmall instead of buying new. That's $400,000 right there, just from not having tractor payments. Add in never having land payments, never financing anything, just paying cash for what I actually needed, and the money accumulated. Rick's pen had stopped moving. He was staring at Frank. "I've got just over $600,000 in the bank, Rick," Frank said quietly. "Liquid, in savings accounts and CDs at 3 different banks, plus the land which is worth maybe another $1 million at current prices, all paid for. I could write you a check for every tractor on this lot right now and not even feel it." The office was completely silent. Rick could hear the clock ticking on the wall, could hear someone working on a tractor in the shop out back. "You remember back in 83, Frank continued. "You told me that old Farmall was going to kill me, said I needed to trade up, take on payments, modernize, or die." Rick nodded slowly. He remembered. "Rick, that tractor didn't kill me. Ran for another 15 years after that conversation. 44 years total, from when my dad bought it in 54 to when the transmission finally gave out last month. You know what kills farmers, Rick? Debt. Debt and trying to keep up with everybody else. Debt and believing that new is always better, that Farmall saved my life because it kept me out of debt." Frank stood up, collected his paperwork. "I saw what happened in the 80s. Half the farmers in this county went under. Good men, smart men, hard workers. They bought new equipment in the late 70s and early 80s, took on big payments, and then prices collapsed. You remember that? Rick remembered. He'd been selling tractors through the whole crisis, had seen dozens of farms foreclose, had seen his own commissions dry up when nobody could buy. Those farmers who went under, Frank said, most of them had newer equipment than I did. They were more modern, more efficient, more leveraged, and they lost everything. I kept farming with my old paid-for Farmall. Everyone thought I was a fool, but I survived, because I didn't have debt eating me alive when times got hard. Frank took his keys to the 4430 and walked toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back. You know the funny part, Rick? That old Farmall is still sitting in my machine shed. I couldn't sell it, even broken. Too much history. My son Michael wants to restore it someday. Says it represents something important about how we built this farm. He walked out. Rick sat at his desk for a long time after Frank left, just thinking about all the farmers he'd sold tractors to over the years, thinking about the ones who'd financed and the ones who'd paid cash, thinking about which group still had their farms. Rick Patterson retired in 2005 at age 65. The dealership changed hands, sold to a larger operation out of Cedar Falls. Rick moved to Arizona with his wife, lived on his pension and Social Security. It was comfortable, but nothing special. They had enough, but they had to budget, had to be careful. Arizona was expensive. Frank Weber kept farming until 2010, when he finally retired at age 84. The old Farmall was still in his shed, and Michael had indeed restored it over the years, working on it slowly on weekends. Got it running again in 2007. Perfect cosmetic restoration, red paint gleaming like new, chrome polished, every part either rebuilt or replaced. Frank sold his 480 acres in 2010 for $5,200 an acre. Total sale price, just over $2.4 million. Added to his existing savings of over $800,000 at that point, he retired with more than $3 million in assets. Not bad for a farmer everyone thought was a fool for keeping old equipment. Frank Weber died peacefully in his sleep in January of 2019 at age 93. The funeral was huge, over 300 people. At the family gathering afterward at the farm, his son Michael started up that old restored Farmall Super M. It fired on the second pull, that distinctive sound everyone who'd known the tractor remembered. The smell of exhaust, the pop-pop-pop of the engine. Carol, Frank's widow, now 97 years old and frail but mentally sharp, stood there listening to it and started crying. Her daughter Sarah put an arm around her. "Your father loved that tractor," Carol said, her voice breaking. "Everyone told him it would kill him. Rick Patterson at the dealership, other farmers, even some of you kids when you got older, said it was dangerous, said it was stupid, said we needed to modernize or we'd lose the farm. But Frank didn't listen. He just kept that old machine running year after year. And you know what? It gave us our life, gave us everything we have. Because we never went into debt for something shiny and new. We just kept our old equipment running and saved the difference." She wiped her eyes. "Rick Patterson died 2 years ago in Arizona. I saw his obituary. His family had to do a GoFundMe to pay for the funeral because he didn't have enough money saved. Sold farm equipment his whole life, convinced hundreds of farmers to buy new and finance, but ended up broke himself. Meanwhile, your father, the farmer everyone thought was a fool, left you children a $3 million estate with no debt, no liens, nothing owed to anybody. That old Farmall didn't kill him. It set him free." Michael had already mounted a plaque on the restored Farmall's hood, right above where his grandfather would have sat for 44 years. It was brass, professionally engraved, mounted with bolts. It read, 1954, Farmall Super M. They said it would kill Dad. Instead, it set us free. 1954-1998, 44 years of debt-free farming. The grandchildren asked to have their picture taken sitting on the tractor. the one their grandfather had been too stubborn to replace, the one that everyone said was dangerous. They climbed up onto that old seat, put their hands on that old steering wheel, and smiled for the camera. Behind them, through the shed doors, you could see the farmland that was still in the family, still producing, still paid for. The dealer had warned that the old Farmall would kill Frank Webber, but Frank understood something Rick Patterson never did. The tractor wouldn't kill him. Debt would. And Frank chose to risk the tractor over risking the debt. Chose to be called a fool by people who thought they were smart. Chose to keep fixing old equipment while everyone else was buying new. Years later, Frank still had his farm, had his freedom, had his family's financial future secured. And the dealer was dead and buried in Arizona, his funeral paid for by donations because there was nothing left. The most dangerous thing in farming isn't old equipment. It's debt masquerading as progress. Frank Webber lived long enough to prove it.